Ruth chapter 4. It's become almost a custom these last few messages in Ruth to take note of repeated words. In Ruth 2, we had the repeated word glean or gleaning. In Ruth 3, we had the repeated words lie down or just lie. Ruth 4 has a repeated word as well, and it is redeem or redeemer. And this word is used far more than glean is used in Ruth 2, far more than lie down is used in Ruth 3. Furthermore, you have the use of words like buy and bought, and those are used interchangeably with redeem. So even when you see the word buy or bought, it's still the idea of redeeming. So let us read the text, Ruth 4, and look out for this repeated phrase, which forms the theme of the chapter and actually the theme of the entire book. Ruth 4, we'll read the first 12 verses. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. And he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, that is the one who was in line before him, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." And the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who built up together the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, who we read about in the Bible reading Genesis 38, whom Tamar bore in Judah because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." We begin, I'd like us to begin our time in Ruth 4 with a mini Bible study. So get your fingers ready to explore a couple of passages in the Bible to try and get an understanding of what is going on here. In this chapter, Ruth 4, Boaz and Ruth get married through what would be a very strange process for us, you and me, but one that in their day was not unusual. In fact, it was not just commonplace for this to happen that we are viewing here, but it was even codified in Israelite law. God instructed the Israelites to practice this, what we've read, by law. And this is called levirate marriage. Levirate marriage was a very interesting and strange for you and me tradition and practice in Israelite law and culture. It is mentioned directly about 3 times and alluded to a few other times in the Old Testament. It also comes up in the New Testament. And we already read one instance of it in our Bible reading in Genesis 38. There we saw levirate marriage at work in practice. And we even saw some of the difficulties, some of the challenges that were associated with this practice. A second place is in Deuteronomy 25. Let's turn there, where levirate marriage is mentioned. In fact, in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 to 10, the law is described quite clearly there. We saw the practice of it in Genesis 38. We see the law stipulated in Deuteronomy 25. Deuteronomy 25, beginning at verse 5 down to verse 10. What is this law and cultural practice? It says, Deuteronomy 25, verse 5, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother. And here is the key, that his name, the name of the dead brother, may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. Now it's trying to persuade him to do this. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of all the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. This was the law. Very strange. Very interesting. It was not complicated. Strange for us, certainly, but not complicated. The point was that a woman whose husband has died without them having a son would be united to the husband's brother in marriage. And when their union produced a son, that son would not be regarded as the biological father's son. That son would be regarded as his deceased brother's son. And the property of the deceased would also go to that son whom he bore. The man who married his brother's widow had no claim to the son whom he bore by the widow. In so doing, the name of the deceased brother would be perpetuated. In fact, the term levirate is taken from a Latin word which means husband's brother or brother-in-law. As strange as this practice might seem to you and me, it was not strange in this time and place. Many nations around the nation of Israel practiced forms of levirate marriage. This was practiced in foreign and pagan nations, such as in the Babylonian Empire and in the Assyrian Empire. In fact, forms of levirate marriage are practiced today all over the world. In Asia, countries like India and China, and even in Africa, countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, Ghana, and by the way, Zambia. We have a form of this in our culture, and I've gone through it. Maybe some of you have. I remember when I was much younger being told that I would receive the name of an uncle who died in the family, my mother's cousin. I underwent some ritual where my oldest aunt, his oldest sister, that cousin, your cousins were, you're all brothers and sisters. So his oldest sister in the family, my aunt, performed this ritual where she drank some concoction that she had made, and I was brought actually to sit down in the middle of the room while the family surrounded right after his burial, and she drank this concoction, mixed it in her mouth, and spat it around my neck, and said some words. And thereafter I was taken into a bedroom with my uncle's wife, and she was told to lie on the bed, and I was told to lie next to her, and I think we had to hold hands, or I was told to push and be right next to her in the bed, and family surrounded, and they said a few words and were released to go. And I remember bumping into her later at around the funeral house, and she smiled and said something like, "You're now my husband." And I said, "Oh, okay." So it's the same concept, it's the same idea. But the form of levirate marriage in Jewish culture that we see in the Old Testament here was somewhat different. It was only invoked in the case where a man died without leaving male children. If there were male children, it was not necessary. If a widow, therefore, already had a male child, they didn't go through this. The brother of the deceased took on his deceased brother's wife, in addition to any wife he already had, and the property of his deceased brother would not be his, but would end up going to the son whom he sired. It was under his care temporarily, but it would end up with the son who he sired. And even in our culture, the way your son would have your surname or take your name, the son he sired would not take his name. He would take his deceased brother's name. So he would still be called the son of so-and-so, not his son. And he would have no claim on the son and no claim on his brother's property. In other words, in the Israelite form of this was a pure act of service that a brother performed to his deceased brother by giving that deceased brother a son, by which his name would be perpetuated and his inheritance would be preserved in the family. Now, it is evident when we read the mentions of this in the New Testament, in the Old Testament rather, that it was not a popular, it was not an attractive proposition for a brother to do this on behalf of his deceased brother. We saw in the Bible reading, Genesis 38, that the son of Judah, dies, leaving a wife, and Onan is brought on to perform this duty, And Onan is unwilling to do it. He goes out of his way to ensure that his brother's wife does not conceive. He wasn't interested. And for that reason, God is very angry with him and actually kills him. And you know what Genesis 38 verse 9 says? It gives us the reason why Onan was ready to risk his life to avoid this. It says, but Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. That's why he didn't want to do it. He understood this is pure service. There's nothing for me to get out of this. The children I give this woman will not be called mine. They will not even carry my name. They'll carry the name of my dead brother. The property of my dead brother, I would simply manage it until the first son is old enough to take over. And so it was not an attractive proposition. Levirate marriage is also mentioned in the New Testament. Look at Matthew in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 22. In fact, it's mentioned quite directly, but there are thoughts that in 1 Corinthians, which we'll look at next, 1 Corinthians 7, that Paul is dealing with a question around the issue of levirate marriage. But let's start with Matthew 22, verse 23, I think up to verse 30. Jesus is being questioned about this practice and some of the challenges that would be associated with it from their theological perspective. Matthew 22, verse 23, the same day Sadducees came to him, Jesus, who say, Sadducees, that there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. This was the issue. You're paying a service to help out your dead brother who did not have any children. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring left his wife to his brother. So to the second and third, down to the 7th, the very last. After them all, the woman died. And here is the conundrum. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? This is a woman who married all through down the line of brothers, and they kept dying until the very last brother who also died. So whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And in here they're basically trying to denounce resurrection or poke holes into the doctrine of resurrection because they did not believe it. And Jesus replies in verse 28, or in verse 29, but Jesus answered them, you are wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So Jesus basically says this is not a problem. Levirate marriage is not a problem in the resurrection because there will be no marriage. There won't be husbands and wives in heaven. There will only be saints in heaven. There are only sisters and brothers in the Lord in heaven. Look at 1 Corinthians 7. In 1 Corinthians 7, some scholars, theologians, teachers think that Paul, although it's not mentioned directly, they think that Paul here is talking about or addressing a question about levirate marriage. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39, where Paul says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So for those of you who are becoming uncomfortable with the idea of marrying your husband's brother, you can rest at ease. This is not binding on us today. No one has to marry their husband's brother. Rather, all Christians, as Paul says, are free to marry whomever they choose to marry once their spouse has died, but with only one limitation, that they marry a fellow Christian. They can only marry in the Lord. So why this law? What was the purpose of this law? We are not told, but I do want to suggest one or two ideas. Firstly, in a culture where women were limited in terms of what they could do, what they could say, what they could own, levirate marriage provided care and protection for widows so that they were not left destitute. And that's exactly what's happening in Ruth, in the book of Ruth. We have two widows. Naomi's husband has died. Her two sons have died. And life is very difficult. In this culture, women were very limited in so many ways. And so by this brother coming in and taking over the situation, he's able to provide care, he's able to provide protection for this widow, and in so doing raise up offspring who can then even take care of her, a man, in the event that he died. And remember, this is Naomi's point in Ruth 1, when her daughters-in-law are saying, we want to come with you. And that's actually an indirect reference to this custom. Naomi says what? Guys, I'm too old. I will not be able to bear you a son in time for him to marry you and take care of you. Levirate marriage, in its strict sense, cannot work for us in this case. In fact, we have another instance where a man died in Numbers chapter 27. I really want us to read that one. Numbers 27, verse 1 downwards. Because I think for some of us, we are already beginning to feel unhappy that women were treated in this way, that they now had to marry in order to survive and be taken care of. And some of us may be wondering, maybe even condemning God for going along with this. You know, why didn't he emancipate women so that they could survive on their own? Why perpetuate this thing? Numbers 27, we have a case of 4 daughters who lose their father, and they appeal that the inheritance must still be given to them, must be shared with them. Because in the law, that couldn't happen, you see. But I want you to notice how God provides now a provision for them to get a share of their father's inheritance. Numbers 27, verse 1. Then drew near the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Micah, son of Manasseh, from the clans of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Is that 5 daughters? 5 daughters. Verse 2. And they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the chiefs and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but died for his own sin. And he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan? Because he had no son. Give to us a possession from our father's brothers. In other words, a man dies, he has no son. There's this rule here that the inheritance, therefore, must go to his brothers. And the daughters are saying, we want a share from what our uncles are getting, from what our father left behind. Verse 5, Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, the daughters of Zelophehad are right. You shall give them possession of an inheritance among their father's brothers and transfer the inheritance of their father to them. And you shall speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of the clan, and he shall possess it. And it shall be for the people of Israel a statute and a rule, as the Lord commanded Moses. One thing we need to understand about Israelite law, about a lot of the things that we read that God had commanded and put in the law, and a lot of them, people use those laws to attack God and say, how could God go along with this injustice, this ill treatment of women? How could God go along, for example, with slavery? Something so inhumane. What we need to understand about the Old Testament is that a lot of the things that we see the Israelites doing, such as Levirate marriage, was commonplace in cultures even surrounding the Israelites, in nations surrounding the Israelites. Just like in Zambia, some of our practices and cultures are common with neighboring countries. This was the case with Israelites. And so what God did in many cases is he came with laws to govern those practices. He came with laws. He didn't come and just say, oh, this is, rubbish, change this, and change this. He left a lot of the culture as it was, but put in laws that brought some righteousness, some justice to them. Brought in laws that protected those who were inferior by those practices and would be taken advantage of. And one example is actually slavery itself. People say, why did God not say no more slavery in the Old Testament? Why is he supporting it in the New Testament? He's not supporting it. What he does is, rather than start a revolution against slavery amongst his people, he brings in laws that manage what is already happening. And by the way, slavery looked quite different from what we understand of slavery compared to the days of the Bible, almost a different animal. But this is the point. God managed. So in the Old Testament, there was the year of Jubilee that was in law. That every 50 years, all slaves would be set free. All slaves would get a fresh start. What's God doing? He's redeeming this culture. He's bringing in justice and righteousness and care for those who are easily overcome by some of these practices and taken advantage of. In the New Testament, he doesn't tell the church, go and, banish slavery and get rid of slavery. No, he tells Christians that if you are a master of slaves, treat them well. He tells the slaves, treat your masters with respect. Work diligently for them. What is he doing? He's applying righteousness and justice to these situations so that these Christians, while they still do these practices, do them in a way that glorifies God and sends a message to the culture to say we are Christians. We still honor God's law, even in the culture and in the things that we do. So that's one idea here, that this Levirate marriage protected widows. Secondly, another thing I would suggest was that at this time, a name was very important. It's like me, I only have a daughter. And if I don't have any sons, that means that my mbewe name will not be able to continue on my line. And a lot of men are concerned about that all over the world. I need to have a son so that, my name doesn't die. Because when my daughters marry, they'll take on the names of their husbands. And so my name will die. It was an even bigger deal in this culture. And we've seen it coming out, to perpetuate the name of the deceased. So that the name of the deceased does not die. We see it with Abraham. I will make you into a great nation. Your name will not die. We see it with the people building the Tower of Babel so that our name is great, so that our name lasts, so that our name has this influence and impact in years to come. And even when God is talking about punishing people, one of the punishments he will talk about was, I will blot out your name from the face of the earth. No one will remember you. And so this thing that was close to the hearts of these people, that their name continues, Levirate marriage provided for that. Two things I want us to observe from Ruth 2. Let's get back to Ruth 2. We've taken quite a while opening up Levirate marriage, and I hope you see why. But I do want to point out two things in the text in Ruth 4, and then make some applications and end. We need to bear in mind that there are two things at stake in Ruth 4. There are two things on offer. There is land and there is a woman. Notice that when the one who has first right of redemption, notice that when he is offered the land without Ruth, he does not hesitate to take it. Ruth 4, verse 3 and verse 4. Then he said, Boaz said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you, he leaves out Ruth from the story initially. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you. In short, he is saying, I want the land, but you have dibs. Do you want it? Because if you don't want it, I want to have it. What's his response? He said at the end of verse 4, I will redeem it. So he wants the land. He's interested in the land. However, when it is revealed that Ruth is part of the deal, he does a U-turn and says, I'm not interested. Verse 5 and verse 6 of Ruth 4. Then Boaz said, he says, I'll redeem it, I'll buy it, I want the land. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead. And here it comes, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Why does he reject? Why? He's interested in the land when Ruth's not part of the deal. When he's told actually the land comes with Ruth, he says, I'm not interested. And he gives a reason. I do not want to impair my own inheritance. What does that mean? Again, Levirate marriage was a service. There wasn't much in it for you. You had more to lose than to gain by signing up for this system. People preferred to not do it and have a woman spit in their face in front of everybody. Look at how in Genesis 38, Onan is killed for not wanting to perform this duty. And Judah, his father, has to now hide the son that is left for fear that if I also send this last son of mine, he will not be interested in this and I'll lose him as well. And so he just keeps his son from Tamar. Why? There was more to lose than to gain. It was a service. Those children would not be yours. The wealth that your brother, your deceased brother had would not be yours. And one of the things he's probably meaning here, one of the things we can suggest is saying, I have to now not only provide an heir for the deceased relative, but on top of that, I'll have to manage his inheritance. And I won't even benefit from it. I'm putting resources to manage this property only to give it to someone. There's nothing in it for me. Count me out. If I was going to get the land without having to produce an heir for the deceased, I would go for it. But now that you are telling me that I have to produce an heir, I am not interested. This is actually a theme in Ruth, this idea of rejection. Ruth is said to be a worthy woman in Ruth 3:11. Boaz is said to be a worthy man in Ruth 2 verse 1. The irony is that even though these two are called worthy, upstanding, these are desirable for a mate, the irony is that in the book of Ruth, there is no interest in them. Look at Ruth 3, verse 7 to 10. Notice that Boaz here, when Ruth makes her interest known, is flattered. Verse 7, when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she, Ruth, came softly, tiptoed, and covered his feet and lay down at his feet. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." What's she saying? Marry me. Marry me. I need your protection and I need your care. Take up this responsibility. And unlike the guy who ran away, squale, that's what we call it, when Ruth was introduced, this Boaz is flattered. Verse 10, and he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." Boaz is flattered that she would pick him. Boaz is flattered that even though there were others who were apparently, seemingly more desirable, younger men, some rich, some poor, that she doesn't go for them. She's interested in him. So even though he's a worthy man, the ladies did not quite see his worthiness and his suitability as a mate, so much so that he is pleasantly surprised at Ruth's interest in him. And we've already seen how Ruth was not the top of the pile for a man. People were seeing problems. People were seeing responsibility there that they were not willing to take on. They didn't feel that she was worth them taking on those responsibilities when they would not get much back. But guess what? Ruth saw Boaz's worthiness. And Boaz saw Ruth's worthiness. In fact, Boaz saw Ruth's worthiness way back in chapter 2. And he shows her kindness. And even she's surprised to be shown this kindness. And he says, "No, what you have done for Ruth, that outstanding commitment you've made to Naomi, rather, it's just amazing. You are an amazing woman." Boaz sees what other men can't see in Ruth. Ruth sees what other women can't see in Boaz. Two worthy people who no one really sees. And in the end, Ruth is even rejected. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out, their rejection. The second thing I want to point out from Ruth for is redemption. Boaz is ready to pounce. It is as though he knew that the man in line before him would back out, and he is ready and eager to take it up and make Ruth his wife. And so he does so without hesitation. Ruth 4, verse 9 to 10. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. And Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife." What do we learn from this? At least two things. One for each. So we've talked about how there is rejection in this passage. What I want us to take away from this is simply this, that the world looks for something completely different from what we as Christians ought to look for in a mate and in a spouse. Here are two outstanding people, completely bypassed by others. The world prioritizes appearance, status, wealth. The first question is, what does he look like? What does she look like? He has to be handsome. She has to be beautiful. The figure, of her body, the figure. One man at church used to say, the shape, brothers, the shape has to be right. The world asks, what car does he drive? Does he even drive? They're literally, the world asks, what has she studied? What has he studied? What is his career in? That's what the world looks for. Those are the things that count for the world. That is what determines who is a suitable candidate for a husband or wife. Things which are here today and gone tomorrow. Things which don't last. As Christians, we ought to look for much more than that. We ought to look for character. We ought to look for people who are walking with God. We ought to look for people who inspire us. There's no doubt Ruth was inspired by Boaz. His kindness. There was a whole message on generosity just because of his attitude and his care. Boaz doesn't hide how impressed he is with Ruth. What you've done for your mother-in-law, everybody's talking about it. It's amazing. We ought to look for people who inspire us and spur us by their lives to love God, to serve him. That's what attracted Boaz to Ruth and Ruth to Boaz. Unfortunately, many Christians are adopting the standards of the world. Christian women asking, does he drive? Me, I can't marry a guy who doesn't drive. A Christian woman. Christian men saying, she's not that pretty. To be honest, Boaz would not pass for some Christians. And Ruth would not pass for many Christian men. What are you looking for? Are you looking for what matters most? Character, worthiness, a love for the Lord? When life happens, that car, that career, and those looks will take you nowhere. They'll contribute nothing to your ability as a couple to withstand the storms of life. To work out your differences that will inevitably happen as you are married. Character will mean everything. That man or that woman's love for the Lord and desire to glorify and honor God in his life will mean everything. 1 Peter 3, verse 1 to 7. That's the point being made here. In 1 Peter 3, verse 1 to 7. It says, likewise, 1 Peter 3, 1 to 7, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by your beauty. No, by your conduct. Verse 2, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. That's what God counts. That's what God treasures. For this is how the holy women, verse 5, who hoped in God used to adorn themselves. How did they beautify themselves? It wasn't by makeup, by jewelry, by clothing, by the gym. It was by submitting to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Ladies, in a day and an age where looks mean everything, where everyone is obsessed with their appearance, can you say that you are more obsessed by inward beauty? Can you say what grieves you more? The hair that is out of place as you look in the mirror, or your life that is out of place? What's more urgent to address? What matters? This is what was attractive to Boaz about Ruth, her worthiness. And if we say we're Christians, then what matters to us must be the beauty on the inside. And you know, the world is putting pressure. All the movies we are watching, it's all about how someone is looking, losing weight, makeup and new hairstyles and all these things. And you are inundated with this. But you must remember your identity as a Christian. You must remember what the Lord calls you to. An inner beauty. Not to say the outer beauty is unimportant, but it's a problem when that is the priority. When that is the most important thing. And men, if you encounter a woman, you're looking for a spouse, and that is what she cares about most, above and beyond her inner beauty, run. Do what that first Redeemer did. Head the opposite direction. Those will not take you anywhere. Secondly, finally, and most importantly, this reluctance that we see of people in the Bible to play the role of a redeemer, to play to be a husband's brother to his brother's wife. It must make us appreciate our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Onan lost his life escaping this role, trying to escape this role. This man we're talking about in Ruth 4, who had first speak, ran away from being Redeemer. There was nothing there for him. It was all give and nothing really to get in return. It was going to cost him far more than he would ever hope to gain. Thank God for our Redeemer. That though it cost Jesus everything, and though he had nothing to gain and everything to lose, by coming down to redeem us from sin, he still went through with it. He did not run off like the Redeemer in Ruth. Thank God that Jesus was not in it for what he could get. His focus was what he could give to save us from our sin. And so he died on the hill called Calvary to redeem us from what Paul calls the curse of the law. How we're running in circles as we're trying to fulfill the law's demands, and it wasn't working. One step forward, 3 steps back. Jesus says, I'm going to take care of it all by myself, and I'm going to redeem these people. Thank God he put his benefit aside to benefit us. You want to know what Levirate marriage is all about? This service and sacrifice that barely anyone in the biblical record was interested in doing. Even now, in other cultures, it only survives in a mild form. You don't have to do it. And that's why it's probably survived. Why is it important? It foreshadows, it points to the work of Jesus on the cross as our Redeemer. It paints it in beautiful colors for us to see it. That Jesus did what these men were unwilling to do because they knew that it's all cost and no gain. But that's what Jesus did for us. Keith Green put it this way: there is a Redeemer, Jesus, God's own Son, precious Lamb of God, Messiah, and Holy One. Jesus, my Redeemer, name above all names, precious Lamb of God, Messiah, all for sinners slain. And in the chorus he says, thank you, O my Father, for giving us your Son. Have you trusted in the Redeemer? Like Ruth, you must know you are hopeless. You're like a widow. In Luke 18, when Jesus is teaching about prayer, he likens us in that parable to a widow in this culture. No options. Nothing that could be done for yourself. You had to go and appeal for help somewhere else. And if that person didn't help you, you were finished. You could not depend on yourself. There's nothing you could do for yourself. That's the picture that Jesus uses when he's teaching about prayer. And that's the picture here. That we are the widow who could do nothing in this culture, hands tied. And like Ruth, we have to make our way to a Boaz and say, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a Redeemer. Have you ever gone to Jesus and said, Lord, spread your wings over your servant, for you are the Redeemer? Outside of you, I have no hope. Save me through what you have done on the cross. Let's pray. Oh, Father in heaven, we want to thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer to top all Redeemers, the Redeemer who shines in bright light because of the many who preceded, who were unwilling to be a Redeemer. Thank you that even though it cost him so much, he was willing to lose everything so that we could be saved. We pray that we would trust in him, that he would be our Redeemer, each and every one of us, that would let go of dead works which cannot save, that would give up on running around in a circle, chasing our own tail, trying to right all our wrongs, correct all our sins, live a life that we'll never manage to live, that can please you, that can cause you to accept us, that would go to Jesus and say, spread your wings over your servant, for you are the Redeemer. Amen. We will get in